Imagine a world where manual labor was the only option, where producing a simple piece of fabric took weeks of painstaking work. Now imagine all of that being transformed in a matter of hours. This was the reality that the Industrial Revolution brought to the world. But how did it all begin? And why was England the epicenter of this radical change? In the 18th century, England took the first steps toward a transformation that would forever change the world. The Industrial Revolution wasn't just about machines and factories. It was about a profound shift in society, economy, and the way people lived their daily lives. From technological advancements to changes in agriculture and transportation, this marked the beginning of a new era in human history. The story begins in the rolling hills and coal-rich lands of England, where a perfect storm of circumstances would ignite the spark of industrial innovation. Before this revolution, craftsmen would labor for days on simple items that we now produce in seconds. A weaver might spend an entire week creating just one piece of cloth. A blacksmith would forge each nail by hand, one by one. This was a world where everything moved at the pace of human hands and animal power. But beneath the surface, change was brewing. Inventors and entrepreneurs were beginning to ask, what if we could harness the power of water and steam? What if we could create machines that would do the work of 20 men? These questions would lead to innovations that would transform not just England, but eventually the entire world. If you love history and want to unravel the mysteries of great empires and transformative moments like this one, like this video, subscribe to the Modern Age Chronicles channel and don't miss a single episode of our journey through the pivotal moments that shaped our modern world. Why England? Of all places in the world, why did this small island nation become the cradle of the greatest economic transformation in human history? The answer lies in a perfect storm of advantages that England possessed in the 18th century. First, let's talk about what was beneath their feet. England was blessed with abundant natural resources that would become the lifeblood of industrialization. Vast deposits of coal and iron ore lay close to the surface and often near to each other, a fortunate geological coincidence that would prove invaluable. While other nations might have had to transport coal hundreds of miles to reach iron deposits, in England, these crucial resources were practically neighbors. But resources alone don't create revolutions. England also had something special in its people. A growing class of entrepreneurs and inventors with both the vision to imagine new possibilities and the freedom to pursue them. Men like James Watt, who improved the steam engine, and Richard Arkwright, who revolutionized textile production, weren't aristocrats or noblemen. They were middle-class tinkerers and businessmen who saw opportunities where others saw only problems. These innovators operated within a political system uniquely favorable to their ambitions. Unlike many continental European countries where rigid aristocratic control and guild restrictions could stifle innovation, England had developed a government that increasingly supported commerce and protected private property. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 had strengthened Parliament and limited royal power, creating a more stable environment for business and long-term investment. Here's something fascinating that many people don't realize. England's naval dominance and growing colonial empire also played a crucial role. With colonies and trading posts around the world, English merchants had access to raw materials and markets that fueled industrial growth. The profits from colonial trade provided the capital needed to invest in new factories and machines. But perhaps the most overlooked factor in this industrial birth was something that happened in the fields, not the factories. The agricultural revolution, which preceded the Industrial Revolution, completely transformed farming in England. New crop rotation methods, improved livestock breeding, and innovative farming tools dramatically increased food production. This agricultural transformation had two profound effects. It created a food surplus that could feed a growing urban workforce and it reduced the number of laborers needed on farms, creating a pool of workers available for the new factories. Imagine being a farmer's son in rural England in the 1770s. For generations, your family had worked the same land in the same ways. Suddenly, new techniques mean fewer hands are needed in the fields. At the same time, you hear stories of opportunities in growing towns like Manchester and Birmingham, where new industries are offering wages that would have been unimaginable to your grandparents. The choice becomes clear. You pack your belongings and join the migration to the industrial centers, becoming part of the first generation of industrial workers. This unique combination of natural resources, entrepreneurial spirit, political stability, global trade networks, and agricultural transformation created the perfect conditions for the Industrial Revolution to take root and flourish in England, forever changing the course of human history. Imagine life before the steam engine. Everything was made by hand, from the clothes on your back to the tools in your workshop. If you wanted a new shirt, someone had to card the wool, spin it into thread, weave it into fabric, and then sew it together, all by hand, taking weeks of labor for a single garment. This was the world before industrialization, where human and animal muscle provided virtually all the power for production. The invention of the steam engine by James Watt in the 1760s was truly a watershed moment in human history. But here's something most people don't know. Watt didn't actually invent the steam engine from scratch. He improved upon an earlier, less efficient design by Thomas Newcomen. Watt's stroke of genius was adding a separate condenser, which prevented the constant heating and cooling of the same cylinder. This seemingly small change made the engine dramatically more efficient, using about 75% less coal than Newcomen's version. What made Watt's steam engine so revolutionary wasn't just its technical improvements, but how it liberated manufacturing from the constraints of nature. Before the steam engine, factories had to be built near rushing rivers to harness water power. They would slow down during droughts and freeze during winter, but steam engines could be built anywhere and run consistently regardless of weather or season. This freedom allowed factories to spring up in new locations, clustering near coal supplies and urban centres. The impact was staggering. Imagine walking through Manchester in 1780 and then again in 1820. In those 40 years, you would have witnessed a transformation from a modest market town to a booming industrial centre, with dozens of factories belching smoke into the sky, their rhythmic mechanical pounding echoing through streets now filled with workers. But the steam engine was just the beginning. The textile industry saw some of the most dramatic changes. The flying shuttle, invented by John Kay in 1733, doubled a weaver's output. Then came the spinning jenny, created by James Hargreaves in 1764, a machine that allowed one worker to spin multiple threads simultaneously. At first, these could spin 8 threads at once, but later versions could handle up to 120. Then Richard Arkwright introduced the water frame in 1769, which produced stronger thread than the spinning jenny. And in 1779, Samuel Crompton combined the best features of both machines to create the spinning mule, which produced thread that was both strong and fine. These innovations created an interesting problem. Suddenly, spinners could produce far more thread than weavers could use. This bottleneck was finally broken by Edmund Cartwright's power loom in 1785, which mechanized weaving just as spinning had been mechanized before it. The human stories behind these inventions are fascinating. Many of these inventors weren't educated scientists, but practical people trying to solve everyday problems. Hargreaves, who created the spinning jenny, was a weaver and carpenter with little formal education. Legend has it that he got the idea when he saw a spinning wheel continue to spin after being knocked over, and these innovations didn't always receive warm welcomes. Groups of workers called Luddites, fearing for their livelihoods, sometimes attacked and destroyed the new machines. The Luddites weren't simply opposed to technology, they were fighting against a system that threatened their way of life and offered them little security in return. By the early 19th century, the mechanization had spread beyond textiles to transform ironworking, mining, printing, and countless other industries. What had once been the work of careful human hands was now accomplished by tireless machines, producing goods at a pace and scale previously unimaginable. The world would never be the same again. As factories churned out goods at unprecedented rates, a new challenge emerged: how to move all these products efficiently across the country and beyond. Before the Industrial Revolution, transportation was painfully slow and expensive. Goods traveled on rutted dirt roads by horse and cart, taking days or even weeks to reach their destinations. A journey from Manchester to London might take a week in good weather, and become nearly impossible during rainy seasons when roads turned to mud. The solution began with water. In the 1760s, entrepreneurs started building canals, artificial waterways that connected industrial centers to ports and cities. The Duke of Bridgewater, Francis Egerton, pioneered this movement when he built a canal to transport coal from his mines to Manchester. This seemingly simple innovation reduced the price of coal in the city by nearly half overnight. Canal fever swept across England. By 1815, the country had over 2,000 miles of canals, creating a vast network of waterways that slashed transportation costs and times. The Bridgewater Canal was so successful that it paid for itself within a few years, inspiring others to invest in similar projects. These canals were engineering marvels of their time. The Pont-y-Sylt aqueduct in Wales, completed in 1805, carried boats over a valley 126 feet above the ground, a breathtaking achievement that still stands today. Canal builders had to solve complex problems like crossing valleys, climbing hills, and maintaining water levels, often with nothing more than basic tools and determined workers. But as revolutionary as canals were, they still relied on horses to pull the barges until the steam engine transformed transportation once again. Here's something fascinating. Did you know that the world's first public railway was inaugurated in England in 1825? The Stockton and Darlington Railway initially transported coal, but quickly expanded to carry passengers, forever changing how people traveled. On its opening day, crowds gathered in awe as a locomotive pulled a train of 34 coal wagons and one passenger coach at the astonishing speed of 15 miles per hour, faster than the fastest horse-drawn coach. The true game-changer came in 1829 with George Stephenson's Rocket, a locomotive that won a competition to operate on the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. The Rocket could reach speeds of up to 29 miles per hour, reducing journeys that had taken days to just hours. Imagine the amazement of the first passengers as they experienced speeds humans had never traveled before. Railways expanded at a dizzying pace. By 1850, England had over 6,000 miles of track, connecting previously isolated communities and transforming the country's social and economic landscape. Suddenly, fresh food could be transported quickly from rural areas to cities. People could travel to neighboring towns for work or leisure. News and ideas spread faster than ever before. Railways also standardized time across the country. Before trains, each town kept its own local time based on the sun's position. But as trains began running on fixed schedules between cities, this system became impractical. Railway companies introduced railway time, eventually leading to the standardized time zones we use today. Communication evolved alongside transportation. The electric telegraph, developed in the 1830s and 40s, allowed messages to be transmitted instantly across great distances. By 1851, the first submarine telegraph cable was laid across the English Channel, connecting England to continental Europe. Information that once took days or weeks to travel could now be transmitted in minutes. This revolution in transportation and communication didn't just move goods and information, it connected people, ideas and cultures in ways never before possible, shrinking the world and accelerating the pace of change. So did you know that the first public railway in the world was inaugurated in England? If you're enjoying this video, please like, share and subscribe to the Modern Age Chronicles channel for more incredible stories. And tell us in the comments, which invention do you think was the most important of the Industrial Revolution? Behind the impressive machines and soaring production numbers of the Industrial Revolution, there was a human story, one often overshadowed by tales of invention and progress. The factories that transformed the economy were powered not just by steam and water, but by the hands of millions of workers, including countless children who faced exhausting workdays in dangerous conditions. Imagine waking up before dawn in a cramped, overcrowded tenement. The air is thick with coal smoke, even indoors. You gulp down a meager breakfast and hurry through dark streets to reach the factory before the gates close at 6 in the morning. Arrive late, and you might lose a day's wages, or even your job. Inside the factory, the noise was deafening. Workers often suffered hearing loss after years of exposure to the constant clanking and pounding of machinery. The air was filled with cotton dust in textile mills, metal particles in foundries, and coal dust in many other factories, leading to widespread respiratory diseases. These workplaces had no safety regulations. Unguarded machinery regularly claimed fingers, hands, and even lives. The workday commonly stretched 14 to 16 hours, 6 days a week. There were no scheduled breaks, no lunch hours, and certainly no vacations. Workers ate what little food they brought while continuing to tend their machines. Stepping away from your station could mean dismissal. Factory owners often locked the doors to prevent workers from leaving or taking unauthorized breaks, a practice that led to tragic consequences during factory fires. Perhaps most heartbreaking was the widespread use of child labor. Children as young as 5 or 6 worked the same grueling hours as adults, often assigned to the most dangerous tasks because their small bodies could fit into tight spaces between machines or under equipment. In textile factories, children were employed as scavengers and piecers, crawling under moving machinery to sweep up waste cotton or tie broken threads together, often while the machines were still running. Many suffered horrific injuries or death. One boy who worked in a cotton mill recalled, "I started when I was 6 years old. My normal working day was from 5 in the morning until 9 at night. I would fall asleep on my feet, and the overlooker would strike me with a strap to wake me. My legs would swell from standing for so many hours, and I would cry on my way home." In coal mines, conditions were perhaps even worse. Children as young as 4 or 5 worked as trappers, sitting alone in dark passages for 12-hour shifts, opening and closing ventilation doors when coal carts passed through. Others, called hurriers, pulled heavy coal carts through low tunnels, often crawling on hands and knees through water and mud. The smallest children were valued because they could squeeze into mining spaces too narrow for adults. Factory wages, while higher than some agricultural work, were barely enough to survive on. Pay was frequently reduced through a system of fines. Workers could be penalized for talking, sitting down, opening a window, or any number of minor infractions. Many factory owners operated company stores and company housing, deducting these expenses directly from wages and often leaving workers perpetually in debt. For women, who made up a large portion of the factory workforce, especially in textile mills, pay was significantly lower than for men doing the same work. Many women worked while pregnant and returned to work just days after giving birth, sometimes even bringing infants to the factory floor. Despite these harsh realities, factories represented a new way of earning a living for many people displaced from agricultural work. For some, they offered more reliable income than seasonal farm work or struggling rural crafts. Many workers, facing few alternatives, made the best of their circumstances, forming tight-knit communities and support networks within the brutal factory system. From these conditions would eventually spring the first labor movements. Workers began organizing for better pay, shorter hours, and safer conditions. The fight for labor rights would be long and often violent, with many setbacks and sacrifices along the way. But this watershed moment in labor history, when workers first began to collectively demand dignity and fair treatment, would eventually transform not just working conditions, but the very relationship between employers and employees. The struggles of those early factory workers remind us that technological progress often comes with human costs, and that behind every great industrial achievement were the hands and hearts of ordinary people whose stories deserve to be remembered. While smokestacks and steam engines were transforming city skylines, an equally important revolution was happening in the countryside. The agricultural revolution that accompanied industrialization wasn't just a footnote to the larger story. It was an essential chapter that made the entire industrial revolution possible in the first place. For centuries, farming had followed the same basic patterns. Fields would be left fallow, unplanted, every third year to allow the soil to recover its nutrients. This meant that at any given time, 1/3 of farmland produced nothing at all. Livestock was typically thin and unproductive, with animals slaughtered before winter because farmers couldn't produce enough feed to keep them alive through the cold months. But in the early 18th century, innovative farmers began experimenting with new approaches. One of the most significant innovations was the Norfolk four-field crop rotation system pioneered by Viscount Charles Townshend, who became so passionate about turnip cultivation that he earned the nickname Turnip Townshend. Instead of leaving fields unplanted, farmers rotated wheat, turnips, barley, and clover or grass across their fields. The turnips and clover naturally replenish the soil with nutrients that wheat and barley depleted. This seemingly simple change had dramatic effects. First, it eliminated the need for fallow years, instantly increasing the productive land by 1/3. Second, turnips and clover provided winter feed for livestock, allowing farmers to maintain larger herds year-round. And third, the manure from these larger herds provided natural fertilizer for the fields, further boosting crop yields. The results were astonishing. Wheat yields that had averaged about 10 bushels per acre in 1600 had doubled to 20 bushels by 1800. In some well-managed farms, yields reached 30 bushels per acre, a threefold increase that would have seemed miraculous to earlier generations of farmers. Livestock breeding saw similar advances. Robert Bakewell, a Leicestershire farmer, pioneered selective breeding techniques in the 1760s. By carefully selecting animals with desirable traits like rapid growth or higher meat yield and breeding them together, he created sheep that produced more wool and meat, cattle that fattened more quickly, and horses better suited for farm work. Bakewell's Leicester sheep became famous for producing 50% more meat than traditional breeds. While visiting Bakewell's farm, one amazed contemporary observer noted that his livestock was the best formed and most completely made he had ever seen, with some sheep reaching weights that would have been unimaginable just decades earlier. New tools and techniques further amplified these productivity gains. Jethro Tull's seed drill, invented in 1701, planted seeds in neat rows at a consistent depth rather than scattering them by hand. This precision planting significantly increased germination rates and yields. Later improvements, like the horse-drawn threshing machine, which separated grain from stalks and husks, reduced the labor needed for harvesting. These agricultural innovations had far-reaching consequences beyond just producing more food. As farm productivity increased, fewer workers were needed to produce the same amount of food or more. A farm that might have required 10 laborers in 1650 could be managed by just 5 or 6 by 1750, while producing more crops and livestock. This created a surplus of rural workers who, finding themselves without employment on farms, began migrating to growing industrial cities in search of factory jobs. This migration provided the workforce that powered the Industrial Revolution's factories and mines. In a very real sense, agricultural innovation created the labor pool that made industrial expansion possible. At the same time, improved agriculture produced enough food to feed the growing urban populations. Cities like Manchester and Birmingham could expand rapidly because the countryside could now produce enough surplus food to feed these non-farming populations. But these changes came with significant social disruption. The enclosure movement, which consolidated small communal farm plots into larger privately owned fields, displaced many small farmers and agricultural laborers. Between 1750 and 1850, Parliament passed more than 4,000 enclosure acts, fundamentally changing rural life and land ownership patterns that had existed for centuries. For many rural families, these changes meant the end of a way of life that had sustained their ancestors for generations. Thomas Hardy, the English novelist, would later capture the poignancy of this transformation in his works about rural England, portraying communities and traditions vanishing under the march of progress. The agricultural revolution perfectly illustrates how the Industrial Revolution wasn't merely about factories and machines, but about a comprehensive transformation of society. From the fields to the factories, from rural villages to bustling cities, the old world was giving way to the new, setting the stage for the modern era we live in today. The Industrial Revolution wasn't simply a chapter in history textbooks. It was the opening of an entirely new book in human civilization. The transformations that began in that small island nation called England would ripple outward, eventually touching every corner of the globe and fundamentally reshaping how we live, work, and relate to one another and our planet. When we look around at our modern world, with its smartphones, global supply chains, megacities, and climate concerns, it's hard to imagine that so much of it traces back to those first coal-powered factories and clanking looms. But the DNA of our contemporary reality was established during those transformative decades. Consider this. Before the Industrial Revolution, for thousands of years, the speed at which humans could travel remained essentially unchanged. Whether you lived in ancient Rome or medieval Europe, the fastest you could go was the speed of a galloping horse, about 25 miles per hour. But within just a century of the Industrial Revolution, steam locomotives were racing at 60 miles per hour. And by the early 20th century, automobiles and airplanes had broken free from the constraints that had limited human mobility since the dawn of civilization. This acceleration didn't just apply to transportation. The pace of innovation itself accelerated. The time between major technological breakthroughs, which had once been measured in centuries, shrank to decades, then years, and eventually months. The Industrial Revolution didn't just introduce new technologies. It created a self-reinforcing cycle of innovation that continues to this day. One of the most profound legacies was the dramatic increase in human population. In 1700, before the Industrial Revolution, the world's population was approximately 600 million. By 1900, it had more than doubled to 1.6 billion. This explosion wasn't just about more people, it was about more people living longer, healthier lives. Life expectancy in England climbed from about 35 years in 1700 to nearly 50 years by 1900. The Industrial Revolution also fundamentally changed how and where we live. In 1700, only about 15% of England's population lived in urban areas. By 1900, that figure had risen to nearly 80%. This pattern would eventually repeat across the globe, leading to today's world where more than half of all humans live in cities. Perhaps most significantly, the Industrial Revolution created an entirely new economic reality. For the first time in human history, each generation could reasonably expect to be materially better off than their parents. Economic growth became the new normal, rather than the exception. Between 1700 and 1900, per capita income in England increased by nearly 10 times, an unprecedented leap in human prosperity. This new economic reality also created new social classes and tensions. The middle class, virtually non-existent in pre-industrial society, emerged as a powerful force. The relationship between workers and employers evolved from personal to institutional, giving rise to labor movements, unions, and eventually new political ideologies that would shape the 20th century. The Industrial Revolution also launched the global economy as we know it today. The search for raw materials and markets drove European powers to establish colonies and trading networks across the globe. Products manufactured in Manchester were sold in Mumbai. Cotton grown in Egypt was processed in England. This interconnectedness, the earliest form of what we now call globalization, created new patterns of wealth and power that continue to shape international relations. But not all legacies of the Industrial Revolution have been positive. The environmental impact has been particularly profound. The burning of fossil fuels, which began in earnest during this period, initiated the climate changes we now face. The first observations of industrial pollution date back to the early 1800s, when Manchester's air became so thick with coal smoke that it earned the nickname Cottonopolis, partly for its textile industry, but also for the cotton-like black snow that fell on the city. In 1843, a parliamentary commission reported that in industrial towns, the leaves of trees were coated with soot, grass struggled to grow, and the air was filled with an acrid, choking smell. These were the first documented cases of what would eventually become a global environmental crisis. The Industrial Revolution also transformed our relationship with time itself. Before factories, most people worked according to the rhythm of daylight and seasons. Factory whistles and clocks replaced the sun and moon as the regulators of daily life. Time became commodified, something to be bought, sold, and measured in ever smaller increments. This shift in perception remains with us today, embedded in our daily routines and our constant awareness of the ticking clock. As we reflect on this extraordinary period, it's worth remembering that the Industrial Revolution wasn't inevitable. It was the result of specific circumstances, choices, and innovations that came together at a particular moment in history. Had events unfolded differently, our world might look vastly different today. And yet, here we are, living in a world that was born in those noisy, smoke-filled factories of 18th century England. The machines have changed, the factories have evolved, but the fundamental transformation from a world powered by muscle, wind, and water to one powered by fossil fuels and electricity, from a world of handcraft to mass production, from rural to urban, continues to define our modern existence. The Industrial Revolution in many ways never ended. It simply evolved into the technological revolutions of the 20th century and the digital revolution of our own time. And it all began on that small island called England, where innovative minds and favorable circumstances combined to change the course of human history forever. As we conclude our journey through the Industrial Revolution, let's take a moment to reflect on this extraordinary chapter in human history. The changes that began in 18th century England weren't just about factories and machines. They represented a complete transformation of how humans lived, worked, and related to each other. Today, we live in a world that continues to be shaped by the echoes of those transformative years. Every time we board a train, shop for mass-produced clothing, or check our smartphones, we're experiencing the lasting impact of innovations that began more than 2 centuries ago. But with progress came challenges. The same industrial might that lifted millions out of poverty also gave rise to environmental concerns we still grapple with today. The factories that revolutionized production also sparked debates about workers' rights that continue to resonate in our modern workplaces. Think about this. Before the Industrial Revolution, most people lived much as their great-grandparents had. But in just a few generations, humanity witnessed changes that previous centuries couldn't have imagined. From steam engines to modern cities, from mass production to global trade networks, the foundations of our modern world were laid during this remarkable period. What aspects of your daily life can you trace back to the Industrial Revolution? Perhaps it's the clothes you're wearing, manufactured in factories that evolved from those first textile mills. Or maybe it's the way you track time, a habit born from the strict schedules of industrial work. Even the way you're watching this video through advanced technology has its roots in the spirit of innovation that the Industrial Revolution unleashed. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. How do you think the Industrial Revolution has shaped the world we live in today? Share your perspectives and let's continue this fascinating discussion together. If you've enjoyed exploring this pivotal moment in history with us, don't forget to support the Modern Age Chronicles channel. Hit that like button, share this video with friends who love history, and subscribe to join us on more journeys through the modern age. Ring that notification bell to ensure you never miss our upcoming episodes about the remarkable events that shaped our world. Thank you for being part of this historical adventure. Until our next journey through time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep discovering the amazing stories that connect our past to our present. See you in our next video.